When you think of the worst time to be born in human history, what period comes to mind? Is it the recent pandemic, the financial crisis of 2008, or the two great world wars? What if I told you the answer is more dreadful than you think? Historians argue a lot over many past events, but when it comes to human suffering and anguish, almost all of them agree that there was a particular time in history when being alive was as close as possible to living a nightmare as it gets. Being born felt like the universe's ultimate curse of suffering and misery, and dying quickly seemed like a blessing. That time isn't the recent pandemic. It was a time far worse than that. Let me take you to the time it all started. In the mid-13th century, the continent of Europe was in absolute chaos. Harvests had failed, the winters were brutal, and people were starving to death. To add to all that, the kingdoms were fighting endless wars, and the poor were paying the ultimate price for it. But if you somehow managed to survive all that as a congratulatory package, you were given a front-row seat of hell on earth. Because what happened next made all the past suffering look like a child's play, and those who died from the famine looked like they won the lottery. Enough of ranting, let's get back to it. Picture this. In the year 1347, a merchant ship docked in the port of Sicily. Rats scurry off, carrying fleas infected with a bacteria no one had a name for yet. Within months, villages turned into graveyards. In just a few years, this plague wiped out an estimated 75 to 200 million people. That's about a third of Europe's entire population. To put things into perspective, just imagine every third person you know is gone. Yes, that was how bad it was. And what made the plague more dreadful was the way it killed. People woke with fevers, chills, and lumps called buboes that swelled on their bodies. Black blotches spread across their skin, giving it the name the Black Death. Some died in days, others in hours. There were no hospitals that could help, no cures, no antibiotics. Doctors wore those eerie, beaked masks stuffed with herbs, but they couldn't stop the death. Families abandoned each other. Whole towns were emptied. Remember, the plague wasn't the only nightmare. If you were unlucky enough to be born around this time, you also lived through the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when crops failed for years and people ate bark, dogs, even the bodies of the dead to survive. Some children were abandoned because parents couldn't feed them. And as if starvation and plague weren't enough, the 100 Years' War was still tearing Europe apart. Villages were burned, soldiers looted what little food there was, and peasants were stuck in the middle. Even if you survived the plague, even if you found food, war could take everything from you, including your life. But while Europe was drowning in famine, plague, and war, what was happening in the Americas? At first, the story looked different for Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The Black Death never crossed the Atlantic in the 1300s, so their biggest struggles at the time were droughts, wars between local tribes, and food shortages. Life was still hard, but it was not the nightmare Europe was facing. But that relative peace did not last forever, because when the Europeans finally arrived in the Americas in the late 1400s and 1500s, they brought their diseases with them. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread faster than armies. Whole civilizations collapsed. Some historians estimate that up to 90% of the native population of Canada, Mexico, and other Americas died within a century of the contact. To put it in perspective, approximately 9 out of every 10 persons you knew died. Entire cultures disappeared almost overnight. For the people of America, this became their version of the Black Death, but it was much worse. And there was no cure at that time. When a Chinese man finally brought the Black Death to America, it did not cause any significant recorded death. So which time was worse? For Europe, the 1300s was a perfect storm of suffering. Famine emptied stomachs, plague emptied cities, and war burned whatever was left. To be born then was to live in constant fear. For the Americas, the 1300s were not nearly as brutal, but the 1500s brought their apocalypse when diseases carried across the ocean killed millions and wiped out whole civilizations. The truth is that both worlds had their darkest hours. Two different times, two different continents, but the same reality. Being born into those worlds meant growing up in the shadows of death. It meant your chances of living to adulthood then were slim, with a high infant mortality rate. If you did make it, your daily life was filled with hunger, fear, and constant danger. And the psychological toll was heavy too. People genuinely believed the world was ending. Preachers claimed the plague was God's punishment. Groups of flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves to beg for forgiveness. Panic turned into violence. Whole communities, like the Jews, were blamed and massacred. It was, without doubt, one of the darkest times in human history. So the next time someone complains about being born in the wrong generation, remind them of this. The worst time to be born as a human? Try the 14th and 15th century, when life itself felt like a curse.